Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this important conversation. My name is Rashida Richardson, and I'm thrilled to be representing the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. OSTP is the team charged with advising the president on issues of science and technology. We work with agencies and departments across the US government, making sure that every American can take advantage of groundbreaking research, new discoveries, critical innovation, from our health and environmental quality to security and shared prosperity. In this session, we'll be focusing on technologies that touch every part of our daily lives. These tools have great potential to make our lives easier and fairer for individuals and communities. At the same time, we're seeing that what can happen when powerful new technologies go unchecked, with a growing body of evidence showing that harms of AI and data-driven tools often fall unfairly on vulnerable and historically excluded communities. President Biden summed it up well. This could be a moment marked by peril, or we can make it happen, or we can make this moment of promise and possibility. That's why the administration is fighting to get development right, to ensure new technologies are rooted in common values like equality, accountability, justice, and integrity. We need a roadmap and a set of democratic principles to ensure all Americans can share the benefits of innovation. Today's event is one session in a multi-part series to engage the American public in the process of developing that roadmap and ultimately creating a Bill of Rights for an automated society. Over the coming months, we are bringing together experts, practitioners, advocates, and government officials to discuss the risks, harms, benefits, and policy opportunities of automated technologies. And we're amplifying the voices of communities in the process. In addition to participating in this series, there are several ways you can weigh in. You can email us about how artificial intelligence has made an impact on your life. You can take part in a listening session about your experience with biometric technologies, or respond to our request for information by January 15th, 2022. We'll drop the links of all these opportunities in the Zoom chat box. And with that, I'll hand things over to our co-hosts for today, the German Marshall Fund.
Thank you so much, Rashida. Welcome. I'm Karen Kornblue, Director of GMF's Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative. And we are delighted to co-host this event with OSTP. And to welcome back Rashida Richardson, who is herself a leader on the social and civil rights implications of data-driven technologies, including AI. The Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative's mission is to support the US and Europe, working with allies in ensuring that the next waves of emerging technologies support democratic values rather than undermining them. This goal is even more important when even more of the offline world is moving online. Our roadmap for digital democracy, developed with Rutgers law professor Ellen Goodman, includes policy proposals for a digital code of conduct, and it explores how to ensure that our rights and protections should be updated to apply to new technologies. Among these are consumer protections, which the panel will discuss today. It is my great pleasure to introduce Devin E. Willis of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, who will be moderating our expert panel today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Before I begin, I just want to mention that this event has been closed captioning available via the live transcript button at the bottom right of your screen if you need closed captioning. But welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. Before we start, I want to begin with the most basic question. Why are we here? And what's the point of having this discussion? We're here because the issues we're addressing today have gone unaddressed for too long. And it's time for us to work together to articulate some rules for the road, a democratic vision for our automated society. It's time to situate technology development and use in our values, equity, accountability, justice, and integrity. We can make this vision a reality, but we can only do it by partnering with a wide range of affected stakeholders, most particularly the American people. So today, we want to focus on the artificial intelligence systems we interact with in our day-to-day lives, from smart systems we use to order groceries and the biometric ID features we use to unlock our phones, to the apps that read our license plates to make it easier to get through traffic, and the sensors that help pick up our neighborhood trash and recycling. These technologies have some obvious upsides, They can make our lives easier and more convenient, improve our quality of life, and make key resources more accessible for individuals and communities. But we know we can also pay a price for these benefits. For some communities, cost barriers can keep these tools out of reach. And for all consumers, concerns about privacy now seem to crop up regularly. We need a roadmap for all of this, a way to help us navigate all these issues, the good, the bad, and the complicated. So today, our panel will weigh in on what's working and what needs serious examination when it comes to these AI-enabled products. They'll talk about the trade-offs consumers may not be aware of and evaluate the strength of our current protections. And they'll help us think deeply about these important privacy questions and articulate how best to glean the benefits of tech while upholding accountability, protecting people against predatory surveillance, and safeguarding against abuse, bias, and discrimination. So now it's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists. First, we have Karl Holzhauser, Senior Vice President for Operations and Strategic Initiatives at TechNet. Next, we are joined by Surya Matu, Senior Data Engineer and Investigative Data Journalist at the Markup. Next, we have Jennifer Clark, Professor and Head of City and Regional Planning at the Knowlton School of Engineering at Ohio State University. Then we are joined by Tamika L. Butler, Principal at Tamika L. Butler Consulting. And last but not least, we have Mariah Montgomery, the National Campaign Director at Power Switch Action. Thank you for joining us. So I have a few questions that I'd like to ask our panelists to initiate our discussion. However, before I ask my questions, I want to let everyone know who's joining us today that you can post questions for our panelists through the Q&A function on the Zoom. It should be there near the chat. So Karl, I'd like to start with you. You have the opportunity to work regularly with a vast array of technology and innovation organizations in the private sector. Can you share with us your perspective on how we can ensure that we create policy environments that continue to incentivize and encourage technological innovation while remaining vigilant about consumer protection and privacy?
You bet, and thank you, Devin. I really appreciate you having me today. As was mentioned, I'm Karl Holzhauser, and I'm the Senior Vice President at TechNet. And I've spent most of my career in technology policy, and I'm just thrilled to be here to discuss such a critical issue with this amazing panel. For those of you that might not know, TechNet is the national bipartisan network of technology CEOs and senior executives that promotes the growth of the innovation economy by advocating a targeted policy agenda at the federal and at the 50-state level. Our diverse membership includes dynamic American businesses ranging from startups that might be in a garage even still today to the most iconic companies on the planet. And we represent over 4 million employees and countless customers in the fields of information technology, e-commerce, the sharing and gig economy, advanced energy, cyber, venture capital, and finance. Our members and our policy principles on a range of issues can be found at our website at technet.org. As we all know, the unbelievable promise of AI to transform and revolutionize the way we live and work is absolutely astounding to consider. AI can assist persons with disabilities, train workers, boost worker productivity, advance the field of medicine by detecting disease and advancing the development of cures, enhance product innovation, and help defend our nation, including against the rise of cyber attacks we've all been seeing. And lastly, to do things like empower students, healthcare workers, consumers, and businesses with tools and conveniences to help them rebound and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is just to name a few. TechNet's view is that AI development should be embraced because of its potential for improving our lives is almost limitless. However, AI innovation must be developed and implemented responsibly. The tenet of responsible innovation and the development of appropriate guardrails for the expansion of this technology goes hand in hand with the boundless promise it provides. Policymakers, including President Biden, Director Eric Lander, FTC Chairman Lena Khan, and others are right to consider frameworks for ensuring that innovation complements our values and protects against bias, bad actors, foreign influence, and doomsday scenarios we've seen for decades on both awesomely bad and critically acclaimed movies that explore this subject, usually with a rogue computer that decides to take over the world. We've all seen them. I watch them on TNT all the time. As we all know, these are sensational representations of the potential harms of not responsibly innovating. But there are practical, tangible, and very near-term areas of focus that TechNet urges all to consider now. Things like privacy, transparency, data veracity, security, bias, and workforce and worker protections, to name a few. As a trade association, TechNet operates from a set of very transparent policy principles adopted by our members every year and listed on our public website. And this serves as our constitution as we advocate for the technology industry. TechNet's principles in this area call for policies that support responsible AI and responsible innovation and lay out a roadmap for doing so with the following pillars of focus: govern, design, monitor, train, and protect. These pillars are the backbone of our AI principles, and we urge all to consider them as an AI Bill of Rights and other legislation or regulation is contemplated. I'll briefly lay these out for you now. We start with govern. AI must be created within a framework that is anchored to our shared core values, ethical guardrails, and regulatory constraints, in addition to an organization's operating principles. Design. AI should adhere to a responsible by design architecture and be deployed with trust and other safeguards built into the design. This means an adherence to privacy, transparency, and security. And monitoring. Through its life cycle, AI must reflect human values and ensure that its performance is appropriately monitored and evaluated. AI must not perpetuate bias and discrimination, especially against vulnerable populations. Oversight and accountability enables humans to assess the need for improvements to ensure safety, fairness, and trustworthiness, protect against malicious activity, and address flawed data sets or assumptions. Train. Support active upskilling is a key part, which we have to address through education and training, human-computer symbiosis, helping to move employees from executing rote tasks to providing analysis that requires judgment and real-world understanding, and encourage the promotion and growth of training and workforce development for AI. This includes using unique techniques and practices to identify skills gaps and promote the learning needed to succeed in AI. And finally, workforce development must also take steps to address potential displacement through retraining and the use of AI technologies to help current and future workforces. And then finally, protect. In order to preserve our national security, certain technology-focused export restrictions such as international traffic and arms regulations and arms control regulations should apply to AI. From finding and curing disease, to increasing protection of our critical systems, to enhancing the way we buy goods and services, to securely transacting and communicating using our smartphones. AI offers much to be excited about, but ensuring ethical, value-based regulation of this new frontier is critical. And the time is now to lay the groundwork for policies that will help protect against the unbridled harms of this advancing area. Russia, China, the EU, and others are actively working towards these guardrails, which is why the President and Director Ladner are right to take this first step by considering an AI Bill of Rights. TechNet supports this project and looks forward to partnering with the administration as this is developed. Also, I want to take this opportunity to mention that TechNet believes that federal privacy legislation is urgently needed to provide uniformity and standards throughout the US when it comes to protecting consumer privacy and providing regulatory certainty for businesses. TechNet calls on Congress and the President to support the development of a national preemptive consumer privacy law overseen by the FTC that uniformly regulates data. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to taking your questions. Devin, thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl, for that and for sharing those very helpful AI principles. I'd like to move next to Jennifer. Jennifer, you're an expert on urban and regional planning as well as inclusive innovation. As our lives become more entangled with our dependent on technology use, how should we think about the role of technology in our homes, communities, institutions, and shared lived environments? Are there ways technology can make these private and public spaces more equitable and healthier? And are there potential risks and harms they may pose if not properly anticipated and mitigated?
Thank you so much for that excellent question. And I just want to start with some optimism after listening to the specific way that Karl is talking about how we can move forward. I really do want to first thank OSTP and the German Marshall Fund for convening this conversation, because I think we do have some real eyes on how we can look at mitigating risks and taking on these challenges. I mean, really today, what we're finding is that our conversation is situated in a time when we're right between a game-changing infrastructure act. We find ourselves, that just has happened, and we're in kind of the middle of a contentious conversation about the corollary investments that are itemized in Build Back Better. So the language we're using here, I think, is really important and has been one of the key challenges in looking at how we're going to manage the technology that we're facing here. We're actually having a debate about whether we can do infrastructure and innovation better. And that's a really key idea when we think about the risks and harms that we're trying to anticipate and mitigate. I believe we can do better. I think that optimism is an important thing to underscore. And it's important to keep in mind that technological change, or what we call innovation, is continuous and constant. And while these particular technologies, especially some of those that Karl talked about with AI, and their applications, this is the other thing, the very big a set of potential applications, they may be novel, but the process of technological diffusion is not new. But our collective track record on governing technological change proactively before we experience the unintended consequences is really quite mixed. There is definitely space to do better and avoid replicating the same sort of mistakes, which almost always tend to exacerbate and amplify existing inequalities. So the tech sector tends to be pretty enamored with its own perceived novelty, and essentially what it does is fail to do the lit review. So as someone who writes about inclusive innovation and teaches urban planning, I'm compelled to point out that urban planners have a long track record of designing innovative ways to balance contested rights. Specifically, ownership rights and use rights of individuals, companies, or people over and against the rights of other people and other firms, and balanced against the health, safety, and welfare of the whole community. And I would argue that we find ourselves in some ways there today with these questions. So in considering data rights, we might turn to the example of the technological change that accompanied the rapid urbanization in the last century. These changes reorganized places and altered individual behavior, much as we see today. So it also led cities to develop a set of regulatory tools capable of adjudicating contested property rights and allocating use rights for both tangible and intangible assets. And I think this is really important when we talk about data, is how we think about these intangible assets. So I think about the development of easements for public access across private property, so owners cannot deny citizens the ability to reach beaches or utilities to provide services. I think about the development of air rights. So developers cannot build skyscrapers that cut off light and air from adjacent buildings and existing neighbors, or at least they can't without consent and compensation. And I just want to pause here to acknowledge that in urban planning, there have been pendulum swings, to be sure. In the process right now in urban planning is in the process of developing inclusionary zoning policies after what were decades of enabling exclusionary zoning that reinforced spatial segregation, amplified practices, private sector practices like redlining. So really the undoing of these legacies is manifestly and incomplete at the local level. And that is one reason why we have to think about the scale of governance. So returning specifically to the data rights debate, I want to highlight the terms consent and compensation. I have found it very useful to think about smart cities and the questions around data rights to remember a key phrase from the disability rights movement: nothing about us without us. It never ceases to amaze me that under current conditions, the tech sector believes it is entitled to collect data on individuals and institutions, claim both ownership and use rights to that information to the exclusion of other actors, and then subsequently assert the right to analyze and commercialize that data, both as a raw commodity, selling batches of individual data, and on the products derived from and dependent on that data, the algorithms, the software, without the consent or compensation of those from whom the data was derived. So the exercise of exclusive rights limits competitions on entrepreneurship and ultimately innovation. It also stymies the non-commercial research needed to understand how new technologies can expand access, opportunity, and equity. These are the promises we all want these technologies to keep. So in many cases, the public sector, our own government, has accepted this assertion without requiring the consent from those from whom the data is collected. Interestingly, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, does address this component of this somewhat, but requiring compensation for individuals from whom the data is collected still is something largely undiscussed. So one might expect that given that the market price of most collected data is fairly uncertain, requiring compensation for its collection would slow down the tech sector's practice of vacuuming up vast troves of data on individual behavior and characteristics in anticipation of some future use case. And it is the collection that is particularly pernicious when it comes to privacy and security. And it is the use cases, however, that are more concerning for equity and integrity. So I will just close by taking note of what the tech sector seems to want from regulation. Importantly, the tech sector wants national scale regulation. It is always worth noting when an industry born of the world of flat, the world is entirely flat, thinks that there is a preferred scale of intervention. So even as cities and states have the jurisdiction to design and implement governance frameworks to address data rights, it is the industry that does not want to deal with that level of variation. To them, the local is the enemy because it is complicated and expensive to consider the vast array of voices and interests that exist in and across our different communities. Fundamentally, the preference is for the algorithm to handle our differences, and that should probably tell us something. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Those are very important issues that you've raised that we need to really think about as we look at emerging technologies and the importance of consumer data rights. So thank you very much. I'd like to move next to you, Tamika. When the term smart cities is used, smart is often used to refer to the technological part. But to be effective, these projects must have strong and smart government leadership, stakeholder engagement, and more. Tamika, you've advised governments in the private sector on how to think about these and other projects with the equity as a driving principle. Can you share your thoughts on how and why smart city projects must center equity and some of your work on these issues on the local level, please?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Devin, and to the German Marshall Fund and the White House. Excited to be here with this illustrious panel, and so glad you asked that question. I really think, when we're thinking about smart cities, and I'm an urban planner, I've done urban planning work across a number of different sectors, from parks to transportation. And a lot of, when I think about what's happening with the technology industry and the urban planning industry, something I often tell people to think about is who's doing the work, right? In urban planning, we know that white people are overrepresented. And what I mean by overrepresented, the proportion of white folks, I think there's like 89% of urban and regional planners who are white, which is a higher percentage than in many parts of the country, right? We also know that a lot of those folks have traditionally been men, older, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual. And so that's who's planning our cities. And so sometimes when I talk to people, I say, you know what, urban planning has a white problem, but so does technology. So when you take an industry like technology that is also heavily dominated by white males, able-bodied, cisgender, right? Like the whole list, then we're taking two industries and we're combining them that are not the most diverse, and we're asking them to solve problems for a country that is becoming ever more diverse. And so when the example I always give folks is, sure, I want a smart city with lots of technology, but when studies come out that say that autonomous vehicles are less likely to recognize dark-skinned people, there are a lot of folks who are surprised. But for those of us who are Black, we're like, yo, have you ever been in an airport bathroom trying to use the sensors on the sinks? And sometimes I get responses from non-folks of color who say, you know, they never work for me either. And what I always try to encourage folks to think is, they work less for me. So if you're already frustrated, think about this. And when that car, that autonomous vehicle doesn't see darker skinned people, why would I be surprised when the people sitting around the table programming the algorithm don't look like me? When they all go out for their field test, there's no one to be like, yo, bro, I don't think that car saw me. Because we're putting together teams that all look alike. Even on panels like this is more diversity than you often see, right? And so I think we have to really be clear that smart cities can't just magically become smart with technology. Technology is still built by people. Cities are still governed by people. So we still have to center people in all that we do. Equity cannot be an afterthought. It has to be a critical component of all the work. It can't be something we think of as a luxury. It can't be something we ghettoize to the outreach part of our projects. We have to really make sure that equity is intimately integrated into all that we do. And then we have to start measuring our success, not just by outputs, but by outcomes. You know, how folks are actually impacted, but also by process. I think too often we get to this place where we just want to do equity and we don't want to acknowledge the way, especially if we're thinking about this from an urban planning perspective, or even from a governance perspective, that these are tools that have usually been used to exclude, to segregate, and to keep certain people as the other. And so we can't just deny this history. I know we don't like to talk about what we're teaching in our history classes these days, but we can't deny the fact that there is a history of exclusion and how we build out our built environment. And that doesn't change with technology. We love technology because it certainly can make life easier, but it can also, if you talk to Muslim Americans after 9/11, did it make their life easier? Right? If you talk to me, sure, maybe there are some apps where I'm more likely to catch a ride than I was with a taxi, but it doesn't mean that I still don't make sure that if it's between the two of us, my white wife with a very non-ethnic name is the one who requests the ride, because I still know that these things happen. And so we have to be open to saying that there have been past inequities, and we have to be transparent in our work about how we want to fix them. I believe we have to start with race. We have to start with race, despite the fact that I know it scares so many folks. We can't deny that race has been a part of our society always. Sometimes people say, well, why is it always about race? I don't know. I'm not the one who makes all the forms that makes me check my race. I'm not the one in those positions of power, but we have to realize that those in power have made race a determinative factor in so many things, and that can't change when we're talking about smart cities. We have to start with how this impacts people who are racialized in this country, and we have to think about how this technology is going to intersect with other needs. So if we're thinking about technology that's going to help with public health or transportation or whatever it may be, we have to think about the fact that those things are probably tied to other aspects of life. We also have to think about true inclusion. We have to have a principle that is about inclusion. And many people think that inclusion means everyone's welcome here, but true inclusion and equity work are about power. We have to be willing to shift some of the power. Who has the power to make decisions, to designate budgets, to decide who's on panels? We have to be willing to share power and not just give it to the people who have historically had it. That means centering historically oppressed voices and communities first. We have to go to those communities. We have to talk to those folks. We can't just come in on our white horse and say technology is going to make the city smart and your life's going to be better. We have to ask them what they need, what they want, and we have to start valuing community knowledge as real expertise. Consultants can't be the only ones making the money for telling people what to do. Once we start doing these things, we can truly center equity. I will never be a person that says technology is all bad because I'm on my phone way too much. I'm answering calls on my watch. I'm doing too many things to say out of hand that technology is bad. But we still have to realize we can't just throw our hands up and say, well, there were these unintended consequences. For people of color in this country, particularly Black folks, particularly Black women, there's no such thing as an unintended consequence. It is something that we are not paying attention to, that we are choosing not to care because the folks in power decide it doesn't impact them. And if this pandemic taught us anything, as we designated essential workers here and there, we depend on Black and brown low-income folks in this country. They are essential. And so we have to start centering them in all of our work. We have to think about privacy, we have to think about data, and we have to think about people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamika, for those very important and meaningful points that you've raised. One of the major challenges in consumers' widespread day-to-day use of data-driven technologies is the extent to which data and information on individuals is being collected by corporate entities without their awareness. Surya, through your journalism, you've dug deeply into these issues. Can you share with us some of the key issues you see in this space of corporate transparency and consumer awareness in regards to digital technologies?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. For those who I don't know, my name is Surya Mattu. I'm an investigative data journalist, as was mentioned earlier, at the Markup. And for those of you who don't know the Markup is a nonprofit newsroom that investigates how powerful institutions are using technology to change our society. So this question, Devin, that you just asked is something that we think a lot about, because what we're really trying to do is find through our investigations, build the evidence that shows the specific harms that are coming up to consumers and users of technology, so that we can then learn from those harms in the real world to see what can be done at a broader policy level around these issues. So, for example, one of the tools we built at the Markup is a tool called Blacklight, which basically is a real-time website privacy inspector. You can try it out yourself by going to themarkup.org/blacklight. And essentially, what Blacklight does is it lets you type in any website, and what it does is a real-time scan of that website and run 7 different tests to see the different ways in which tracking technologies exist on that particular website, and more specifically, which companies that website might be sending your data to. Now, when we built Blacklight, the reason we built this tool was because we noticed there was this void in the ecosystem, in the technology ecosystem. You know, there was a lot of interesting academic research that existed showing how at a high scale, like, you know, what does tracking look like at the top 1 million websites on the internet? You know, they were doing these sort of like web census surveys and giving us a sense of that. Simultaneously, there were tools such as privacy, like browser extensions, privacy ad blocking browser extensions that would prevent those sorts of tracking technologies from you know, sending a user's data from their device. But there wasn't really a way for an individual to be able to see how the tracking was happening and affecting them. So we'd read about these issues at a high level. The surveillance economy exists, it's really terrible, all my data is being collected, but there's nothing, I don't know what to do about it. And something we think a lot about at the Markup is how do we give our readers a sense of agency and not apathy around their relationship to technology. One of the things that we found through the work we've done over the years is technology, the conversation on technology can be incredibly apathetic. And the thing that I always joke about with my colleagues is, if I want my mother to be apathetic about something, I want it to be about her role in the environment and the role she's playing towards climate change, not technology. Like, this is so, you know, human constructed and like something we can really work with, that we shouldn't have to kind of feel that apathetic about our relationship to this thing, because the complexity is completely human generated. So for me, it's what that basically, all that is a build up. The most important thing I think that's missing right now in consumer technology is there's a huge lack of interpretability around the technologies and like the algorithms that are running them. So just as an example, you know, this tool I mentioned, Blacklight, when we released it a year ago, we did a survey of the top 80,000 most popular websites and found that about 86% of them had some form of tracking, third-party tracking technology on them. A lot of that was related to advertising and advertising tech. we actually reached out to a bunch of websites that were targeted towards vulnerable communities. So, websites targeted towards transgendered folks, transgendered military veterans, folks who were looking for an abortion in different states, and went up to them and said that, when we ran our scan, we found a lot of third-party trackers on your site, essentially providing data brokers with information about the people who are visiting your sites. The developers didn't even know the tracking was happening on the sites. And the reason this is happening is because they basically added free third-party plugins basically that made their life easier in how they built the site. And those plugins essentially added in all this tech. Now, there's no reason that should happen other than no one's looking. So the joke I always like to make, again, at the Markup, is that our job isn't to be hackers, it's to be health inspectors for restaurants. We're not telling you about how to break the mainframe, we're just showing you where the cockroaches are. And I think that's the mentality with which we approach our work. It's about hygiene, it's about data hygiene, and that's what we can do to help consumers kind of make more informed decisions around their relationship with technology. So just one point to make around that. So the reason I brought up the 86% number is because if you contrast that to a study that was done last year by PricewaterhouseCoopers in the UK, they actually did a deep audit into ad impressions that were for ads that were bought by brands to be shown on publishers' websites for ad impressions. And they found that only 12% of ad impressions paid for by brands to be served on publisher sites could be accounted for. 12% of ads that were bought online could be accounted for, to be guaranteed and verified that they were actually shown to the people that they were intended to be shown for. So for me, interpretability is the key component that's really missing from this ecosystem. A lot of stuff was built, a lot of complexity was put into the ecosystem, and now we don't know how to unravel it. But if we start kind of getting more specific about exactly what's happening, we'll be able to have more meaningful conversations around the policy things that are happening, and as well as whose power is being affected in this negotiation. So I think I'll stop over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya. Those were very informative points that you raised. Mariah, moving to you. You've worked on a variety of campaigns challenging the way technology can and is changing work, organizing, and lived spaces. How have you been able to engage and bring community perspectives into the analysis of the risks and harms new technologies pose?
Thank you, Devin, for the question, and to the organizers for hosting this important discussion. For those that don't know us, Power Switch Action is a national network of community labor coalitions in 20 metro regions around the country, working on a variety of issues related to economic, racial, and climate justice. And so these issues have arisen organically and with increasing speed in the places where we work. To begin, I want to name some context that I think has been implicit in some of the prior comments, but that I think is really important. The technology that we're talking about, the technologies that we are talking about are by and large controlled by corporations for profit. And we face significant power differences between the private sector and regular people, and the private sector and government, in the form of imbalances in information, in financial resources, and in control of the tech. Smart cities in particular can play a particular role in eroding democracy as they privatize public infrastructure and space and become governed by code in terms of service not visible to, let alone agreed upon by the public. And so in this sense, the risk and harm, as other people have said, isn't posed by the technology, but by the power imbalance that allows some to apply that technology regardless of the harms that it may cause to others. And so this makes meaningful community engagement on these issues particularly difficult. So I want to offer some examples of how this can play out not so well, and then maybe some ways forward. So everyone, I think, is probably familiar with the example of California last year. The gig industry spent a record $205 million to pass Prop 22, a ballot initiative that carves out and excludes app-based workers from the lion's share of workers' rights in the state. And they did it by ballot initiative, which might seem like a very democratic way to do it. But the effort was actually to undo the work that groups like Gig Workers Rising and other workers' rights organizations had done the year before to explicitly include independent contractors, rather workers who had been classified as independent contractors in worker protections in the state. And that effort actually reflected a consensus opinion across all three branches of state government that many workers were being wrongfully excluded under existing law. And so it was to make explicit that they should be included. And that conclusion was in line with the experience of gig workers and an analysis that the apps are a tool of algorithmic management, not neutral platforms. And so while Prop 22 has excluded app-based workers from things like overtime, minimum wage, benefits like workers' compensation and unemployment compensation, polling after the fact showed that many of those who voted for it thought they were protecting workers' rights and making it more likely workers would earn a living wage, highlighting the powerful effects of an imbalance in information between voters and those most impacted, and the tremendous imbalance in financial resources between workers and the companies. On the other hand, transparency, when combined with community organizing, can change outcomes. For example, people are also very familiar with the example of Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, which sought to develop, a significant portion of the waterfront into a very sort of intense, souped up smart city with tremendous concentration of data collection in public space. And initially not much was known about how decisions were being made, how data would be treated. And over the course of the project, actually 4 people ended up resigning from the advisory board of the project, citing those concerns. And community organized through a coalition and other formations called Clock Sidewalk around these issues. And when Sidewalk finally put out its report, it went so far as to prescribe a new and different semi-private governance for the waterfront that pushed back on city authority. And so as more information became available, the dynamic on the ground shifted, and even their sort of quasi-government partner began to have concerns. And ultimately, Sidewalk withdrew the project, citing economic uncertainty. But it's worrying to think that the bargain is, if you want meaningful engagement and accountability, companies may walk away rather than do that hard work. And so, of course, the hope is that it doesn't need to be so difficult, and it doesn't need to be an either or in that way. And so how do we proactively ensure genuine engagement and good governance from the start? I believe that we have to simultaneously draw on the power of government and the expertise and needs of communities and civil society. And government at all levels has to proactively mitigate power imbalances in that process. So I'll share 2 examples that are actually not about technology, but I think could be applied to evaluating technology. Our partner organization in Seattle, Puget Sound Sage, has been working on strategies to engage community members in redesigning energy systems, another place where there's big differences in how much information people have, maybe a sense that it's too complicated for the average person to know, and big differences in resources available. And so over the past few years, they've developed what they call ideation labs that bring together community members and policymakers to do design together. But before they bring people together, they prep each group separately. And so community members get an education in how energy systems work, as well as leadership development that prepares them to sort of really deal with some of the power dynamics in the room. And on the flip side, policymakers are prepped to engage as equals, to listen for the expertise of the community members in the room. Another model that could be interesting in evaluating technology was adopted for a different purpose in LA County recently. The county passed legislation giving workers the right to form public health councils at their places of employment in collaboration with nonprofits and worker centers. And it requires employees to engage with those committees about health concerns on the job. So you could imagine similar committees to evaluate the impacts of technology at work or in another context with another constituency. And here we have the government asserting its support for a particularly impacted constituency rights to have a voice and to negotiate and to provide a framework for exercising those rights. So just lastly, I'll say that there are many cases where the technology we're talking about is largely invisible to most people, including those who are most harmed. And so we need to make it more transparent, though I think we all agree transparency is not enough. And so I just want to say, people don't need to know how these tools work on a technical level to have really important information for how they should work, and have a voice in the policy making. So we have to be willing to start conversations with a wider scope about people's experiences, address the power imbalances, and collaborate with technologists and to then pull out like how is tech playing a role in this, the technology playing a role in this. And so that said, really excellent community engagement around these issues isn't going to change all the power imbalances many people have been talking about throughout this panel. And so we also need strong policy. And I think a tool like a Bill of Rights to set standards in what will doubtless be an ongoing navigation of how we use these technologies can be incredibly powerful and helpful.
Mariah, thank you so much for sharing those real life examples that you raised on the risks and harms that emerging technologies can pose and sort of the real life solutions that you also propose. Those were all very interesting. As we turn to our open question and answer portion of our panel, I just want to remind you that if you have questions for our panelists, to please post your questions through the Q&A on Zoom. I think we might have some time for some questions. So I just have a question for all our panelists first before we move on. I think we have a couple in the chat. In light of the various issues that you've all discussed, what do you think are some of the policy needs in your area of concerns? And are there any policy interventions that may be promising to pursue? So maybe we'll go in reverse order. Mariah, do you have anything to add? Or I know you've talked about some.
Sure. Well, I'll sort of underline a point that, technology, as we know, someone, referenced the Industrial Revolution, will be ever shifting. It's an ongoing element of our life. And so we need continued investment, I think, in strong civil society and community organization as a constant to be part of that policy development and implementation. And particularly in situations like this, where we know some things about what the consequences will be, but also we're trying to anticipate, community organizations of workers are frequently dealing with what is happening right now that is a challenge. And so creating the space to think forward, I think, is something where there is a real role to partner to create policies that support that partnership as one of the inputs. And then the other thing I would raise is, I meant to mention, and I didn't in my remarks, that a great report came out last week from Annetta Bernhardt, Lisa Kresge, and Reem Suleiman at the University of California on worker technology rights. And I think it lays out a framework that could also potentially be lent into the smart city context to some degree, both risk, harms, and possible remedies. So I wanted to lift that up.
I would just echo again the point about that Surya made as well about sort of specificity, like the precision in the language and what we're talking about. And I think that this is one of the key parts of the policy construction, is that we don't have a shared vocabulary about what we're talking about across cases. So this is part of the reason we see this. What Mariah was describing is so interesting. We're seeing very specific local moments of, I would almost call them moments of resistance, but moments of engagement about creating best practices, whether those are best practices that are agreements or whether they're regulatory. We're seeing those at the local level, community driven. The thing about this sector is that it has been industry driven from its origins, not community driven. So that is a big shift. It is a big shift to start to say, okay, how is it that we look at technology? And this is one of the questions in the chat too, which is at what point, Karl mentioned this too, at what point do we get people involved in the conversation? And the answer is, well, at the beginning. Tamika mentioned this too, at the beginning, not at the end where we go, oh, this doesn't really fit. What about the privacy? What about the equity? No, that's part of the design. And that has just not been how this industry has evolved. So it's not clear to me at all that the industry is going to be able to drive the decisions about its own regulatory frameworks. I think the policy is going to have to come from these examples that we're seeing of functional sort of flipping the script on the industry and saying, no, actually, we're going to be part of the design conversation. So the privacy is built in at the beginning. And these questions of integrity and replication and interoperability as well.
I think, Surya, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Jennifer just said. I didn't want to actually add to that. One of the things that I come from a background of engineering and like technology before I moved into journalism. And one of the things that I noticed structurally as a challenge when we talk about policy and technology is that a lot of the current like distributed, like software that we all rely on, it relies on like auto updates. And there's this framework of continuous integration and deployment that happens with tech where they're constantly, sending updates without any kind of like, it's not a new product that gets shipped, right? It's the same thing that's constantly being updated. So to the point of like, when should someone be in the conversation? I think it should be continuously. And that's something that's hard from a design challenge, because what we think about with policy is like you write it once and then it has to work for a long time. But these systems change so quickly. I think the thing I think about a lot is persistent monitoring and updates. Like, what does it look like to have civic engagement around tech's influence in society in the same way that you have continuous integration and development and deployment for tech products themselves? I think that's like a big policy kind of framework issue that I would like to see more work being done on.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd add is I totally agree with all of my colleagues on this. And I just think policy is so important because we have to get to a proactive space, not a reactive space. And I think Jennifer and Mariah spoke to this, this is industry driven, and an industry that at the end of the day is trying to make a profit. And I think we need policy that can be flexible, that can continuing this monitoring, that can grow with the technology. And we need some sort of framework that allows that to happen without villainizing cities. Because I think what we see is in the absence of sometimes some federal guidance and frameworks and policies, we are having these one-off local, how can we fix this? How can we fix this? And industry is able to organize and defeat kind of some of those. I think a great example, scooters, right, as this emerging technology. Those of us who know this on the geeky side know how much of our data is being collected by these companies. And then in a place like Los Angeles, one of my clients, when they were trying to collect some data, was it right? Was it wrong? But all of a sudden they were framed as the folks who were doing the bad data collection and trying to surveil people, right? And again, it's not who's right or who's wrong. It's just, how do we create some frameworks that then our elected officials are allowed to use and implement? And we know that if some of these industry players are seeking profit, theoretically government is seeking public good. And so we have to make sure that those who are seeking public good have the tools and resources they need to keep up with folks who are burning money to reach their goals. And so I think we have to figure out, and to the points my colleagues already made, this is going to be a culture shift. This is going to be a change in how technology has pushed us forward traditionally.
So
thank you.
Building on,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Devin.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Tamika, I love your perspective, and say thank you so much for sharing it. It's just great to hear the diversity of the panel. And as the person who represents a lot of the companies that you talk about, I want to highlight that TechNet has stepped forward with principles on this, and I believe that guardrails are key to the underpinning of our future economic innovation and growth success here in the US. And we need those guardrails so that our companies can responsibly innovate in an environment that they know and they can understand. And we're not just, trusting that everything will go the way it's planned, right? And if you look at international norms on things like privacy that we've been talking about for 20 years, right now you have EU with a huge regime, you have a patchwork of laws that are being created throughout the US now because we don't have a federal preemptive bill. There's lack of harmony between how the US is talking to the EU and other countries on this critical issue. And I've been working on it my entire career, right? We should have done this 20 years ago because everything would have been in place and we wouldn't have developed this patchwork. Now is the time for us to step forward on AI and responsibly innovate, and to both hold ourselves and our peers in other countries accountable to lay this framework now so that we can harness the benefit of AI and these great and impactful technologies and let them really go and see what they can produce. But they do need those guardrails, which is why we support the OSTP and the president's call for an AI Bill of Rights, but we think it's a first start. We need to legislate and we need to regulate in this space. And I want everyone on the panel to remember that I'm the industry guy who represents the companies who's saying that. So we all agree.
Thank you for that, Karl. So we have a couple questions in the chat, and I think, in interest of time, they're somewhat related. So I kind of want to ask them both at the same time and hear what our panelists have to say. But there was a question sort of about the role that public participation should play in the design of technologies. And then there was also a question to the group about the type of getting involvement from community members, right? There was a lot of discussion from our panelists about ideas and ways that we should get insight from our communities to make sure that everyone's voices are represented. And so kind of the question is, what does that look like? And what does that sound like? And what would be some good tools for sort of starting that conversation and relationship? So Tamika, you're on the top of my screen, so I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So I think, we've said it several times as far as this community engagement piece from the beginning. I think, something I always try to tell folks is retrofitting is always more expensive, whether or not you're talking about physical infrastructure, or whether or not you're talking about bringing in outside voices. Doing it after the fact is always going to take more time, cost more money. And I think we have to so much of this is a cultural shift. I think we have to get to a place where it's no longer, this just takes so much time. And it's like, no, this is just the time we build into the process to make this work, right? And I think that's going to take all of us. It's going to require how government puts out RFPs and how much time they allow. It's going to require tech companies thinking about, is they're taking something to market, building in that time, and that is a culture shift. But I think we have to do it. And then I think the other piece, I said it earlier, and I'll just say it again briefly. I also think when it comes to city planners or public health officials, or when we're talking about AI systems, I don't think participation could be the only place we're talking about equity. I think too often equity gets ghettoized into this outreach bucket. And that's when it's probably too late, even if you do it at the beginning, right? Because even if you're doing it at the beginning, there's been some work done. And so I often tell people that we have to think about how do we do equity externally? How does it look in the interactions we have with people outside of our company or outside of our government structure? But how do we do it internally? What are the practices we have? What are the things we're holding ourselves to? Who are the people on our team? Who are the decision makers? What are the things we put in place? And I think that's a big piece of it, that equity can't just be something that we depend on other people for, because often that work gets put on women, that work gets put on racialized people, on people with disabilities, and those folks are already doing 3 or 4 jobs. And so we have to figure out how to make it both internal equity process and the way things are done, and then also external and the outcomes and the outputs.
I can share an example, particularly because someone's sort of like, what does it look like and sound like to have these conversations? And I'll give an example that's a workplace-based example, but that I think we could learn from. So a member of our network, Warehouse Workers Resource Center in the Inland Empire of California, does a lot of work with warehouse workers around their rights at work. And then we're also part of a coalition called Athena that is focusing on Amazon's impacts on our economy and politics. And in the work that members of the coalition and our partner in the Inland Empire have done, the impact of technology on workers, both physical and mental health, is really apparent. But if you start the conversation with like, what's your issue at work? People don't say, well, the scanner is really ruining my day, right? Like, they're like, it's so stressful, I'm really pressured, I like have to move so fast. But a longer conversation reveals how technology is being used to enforce those conditions, and reveals the imbalance in information that people have. So workers won't even really know what their rate is. They just know if they're making it or not. And they don't have any ability or backing to sort of negotiate around that. And so actually this year, a number of organizations in California were able to pass a bill called AB 701, which was really based on a lot of testimony from workers, that requires warehouse employers to disclose the quota systems they're using, to tell workers what their own data shows about their rate of work, and gives workers the right to refuse unsafe rates of work. And it's a step in the right direction. It's not going to solve the whole problem, but it gives a foothold for workers to at least have some more information, and for advocacy organizations. So I lift that up both to say, like, communities may not start with the specifics of the tech, but you can get there if you talk, longer and are asking good questions. Because workers would definitely say they're surveilled, but they wouldn't necessarily talk about the actual technology, right? And so that's one thing. And then the other thing I want to point out is that the reality is that to have really good engagement, you have to have some level of trust and belief that what you say is going to matter. And many governments do not have that with their constituencies, particularly with constituencies of color and working class people and immigrants. And I think that not as an intermediary, but as an element of support, community organizations, civil society unions all have a role to play in trying to bring some of that trust into the room, balance some of the power dynamics that may exist without it, in order to be able to have conversations that are both really substantive and really honest, because I think that's a real barrier.
Devin, do you mind if I jump in for a second? Yeah, so I think this really highlights a distinction that I just want to make about the privacy and data and privatization of data. And so we're really the privacy conversation sometimes slips into a privatization story, and it doesn't really know that we don't really know we're going there. And by what I mean to say is, particularly if we look at the urban context where a lot of this has come up, we've got cities that contract with the private sector to provide services, right? So when that happens, the data that's collected generally then belongs to the for-profit firm that is providing the service that's been contracted for. So for citizens, they see their city providing a service, right? They think it's a public service. And indeed it is, but it's being provided by a private sector contractor who then has written into that contract that they own the data collected, right? So what ended up at one point being a question of sort of, hey, look, we're collecting data for the purposes of optimizing systems, right? Which is a public interest. We're not doing that anymore. It's sitting with this private sector company for the purposes of their own private market interests, right? To understand behaviors, to gather more demographic information, to build the algorithm, to build the app. And that conversation, I think, is a conversation we need to think about. I agree that it's a big deal in the workplace context as well, because the collection of health data has happened this way, financial services has happened this way, and then public services has happened this way as well. And we need to better understand whether we're talking about privacy issues or whether we're talking about privatization, and how comfortable we really are with private firms collecting this information through a public service sort of conduit and then using it for their own purposes rather than for a public purpose more broadly, particularly when we've consented to or thought we were consenting to.
Okay, I don't know if anyone else wanted to add anything. If you do, just tell me to stop. But I think we're getting close. So a couple other questions. What else about these issues do you think policymakers need to know, or members of the public? I know we've talked about sort of making sure we have better insight into what the community needs. But what are some other issues that you think policymakers should be aware of?
One thing that something that we use at the Markup a lot when we're doing like a new investigation, especially around a new piece of technology or an existing piece of technology being introduced into a new, into new space, so what we find often is like technology is used, the garb of innovation that technology provides is actually a way to cloak the austerity that it brings with it. And I think that's something we think a lot about when we are doing a new investigation. So for example, one of my colleagues, Lauren Kirchner, did an investigation a couple of years ago around tenant screening software. And this is software that was really designed to, allow landlords to screen tenants to do background checks to ensure the safety of their spaces. And what Lauren found through investigations was a lot of the software didn't work well at all. It was like there was a lot of false positives in how this software works. They were really bad pattern matching, like really just like basic stuff around how they were trying to match people's names. Wrong identities were being used for the backgrounds of different people, and so on and so forth. And when you start thinking about and the people who got those bad checks didn't have a way to really highlight that issue and bring it up to someone. And that's why I bring up this thing of austerity, because like if you're building a new like if this was like something done as a as a top tier product, there would be huge customer support kind of side to go with it, along with bringing that technology in. So I think sometimes Jennifer made a really important point about the data and like what can be done with the data once it's been collected. But I think even on a more basic level, there's just this idea of like, if you're introducing a new piece of tech, it's going to break and you need to have customer support to make sure that you can actually provide the software and the service that you think you are going to provide.
I think, something we've already spoke to, but I don't think it's hurtful to say this one again. This isn't easy, right? This is going to be a lot of work. This is going to be some culture change work. And so I think policymakers need to dig in. And I think that means both resources wise, but also with this view that I think this is, figuring some of this out, whether or not is there a Bill of Rights or how do we figure out what to do? This is going to be huge for a lot of the things we face as a country, whether or not it's public health, whether or not it's climate change. Technology has a role to play. And so this work is important. And I think something that has been done well with the creation of this of even this panel is the recognition that it's going to require a lot of folks from different fields who can think about this together. There's never going to be one right way to solve a problem, but having some of those, and I think, often when we talk about diversity, we think of some of those protected classes, race, gender, whether or not you have a disability. But I also think diversity of professions and perspective and fields are really going to be what's needed to solve this problem. I think the conversation we've had today is a great example of when we're all coming from different places, you're able to get somewhere. And that means that you can't necessarily say these are the bad actors and these are the good actors, and we only want the good actors. It's going to take industry and academics and practitioners and privacy experts and lawyers and technologists. It's going to take a wide range of people to tackle these problems, and that's going to be an investment in time and resources and doing things differently. We need policymakers to not say, but whenever we've had an emerging problem, this is how we've always dealt with it. Well, that keeps us in that reactive place, not that proactive place. And we got to be willing to do things differently.
Building on what Tamika said, that only 23% of consumers of US polled consumers in a recent poll that was reported on by The Hill think that the government is doing enough to protect their data. Our electorate has spoken, and they believe that we need much more regulation in privacy and data. and that extends to AI. And part of it is this patchwork. I'm thinking about communities, Tamika, and I live in Washington, D.C. But if I take my smartphone and I go 5 minutes from here into the border of Maryland, or I go 15 minutes into Virginia, it's going to be a totally different regime that's going to cover what happens and what's happening with the data. Different contracts, each company's negotiated differently. We need to once and for all end this patchwork and make sure that there's ubiquity and uniformity on issues like privacy and AI, so that no matter where you come from and who you are, you get the same shake from the system. And that's why TechNet's calling for this national privacy law. And actually, we're starting a campaign. We're calling In the Privacy Patchwork, which you can actually visit our website, intheprivacypatchwork.com. That is a multi-industry campaign calling for Congress to act on this. The public is not divided. Only 23% think that they're doing a good job. Time to act.
Well, thank you again. Oh, go ahead, Mariah.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, I mean, we're an organization that works largely at the regional and sometimes the state level. And I think that a tool like a National Bill of Rights could be incredibly helpful. And I also want to recognize that not every place and community is the same. And we have seen situations in the state, at the state level in particular, where corporations use state interference to stop localities from doing more progressive things than the state is doing. And so I think setting a level ground is a great thing to do, but we need also the room to try things locally and to be as sort of expansive locally as maybe the desire and the right of the community to be. So I think figuring out how to balance those things in this process is an important piece.
Am I on? Well, I just, this was a very interesting, informative discussion. I really want to thank all our panelists again. And, I am honored to be part of this discussion. So, I'm now honored to also introduce for you Rashida Richardson, the Senior Policy Advisor for Data and Democracy at OSTP, for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Devin, for being such a wonderful moderator. And thank you to all our panelists for sharing your ideas and offering your expertise. And thank you, everyone who tuned in from across the country to be part of this discussion. In the coming months, OSTP will continue hosting a variety of engagements where we want to hear from partners and experts across the federal government, in academia, civil society, the private sector, and communities all over the country. Technology can work for everyone if everyone is included. So we want to hear from you and engage everyone. So before we close, I want to invite you to share your feedback with us about any of the issues that was discussed on today's panel by emailing your feedback to ai-equity@ostp.eop.gov. We're grateful for you being with us today and look forward to your continued engagement in the weeks and months ahead as we create the Bill of Rights for an automated society. Thank you all, and thank you to everyone who participated on this great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.